Good morning.
Good morning.
Oh my gosh. Becky put me in the corner politely before I got up here, and she says there's a lot of incredibly intelligent growers in this audience. And she says, you better have brought your A game. With that, information is important, but one thing, John Kemp is suffering from the flu, and thoughts and prayers go out to him for healing, because above all and above everything else, our health is the most important. 24 hours ago, I got the message that I was going to give a talk on advancements in nitrogen management. I'm not sure what John was going to talk about, but I'm going to give you some things that we have seen working over the last 38 years. And what I mean by that is you may not have heard about our company. We're a very quiet, non-advertising, non-public company. And some of the conferences I get asked to speak at, they say, well, you're a disruptor. It's like, well, I don't know if that's completely positive. I said, what does that mean? It's like, I try not to interrupt people, I try to be polite. They said, no, not interrupter, a disruptor. It says you disrupt the flow of synthetic chemicals and fertilizers to the growers. So some of the things I may say may be new. What I will talk about is the information that the Fortune 500 companies that hire us to come work with them are doing. I can't tell you who they are because most of these companies have given me a confidentiality or a non-disclosure statement that I can't talk about what they're doing. Many of these companies that we work with are on the name brands in the grocery store. And make no mistake, they don't want anybody else to know what they're doing. We lose more customers every year than any other company. And I'm going to say that again. We lose more customers than probably any other company because they graduate from what we tell them as far as aiding in nitrogen management, aiding in plant health. And this doesn't matter if you're a GMO farmer or a conventional or organic or no-till or minimum till or anything else that I didn't cover. All plants need the same thing. So when we start looking at things, some of the things I'm going to say may not resonate as common sense, logical thought process until you look at it. Before I start, I do a lot of traveling. And quick little story, we do a lot of work in the state of Florida with strawberries and oranges, and northern Florida with pecans, and we have a friend down there that's a realtor, and he made a huge sale, huge sale, and he was going to celebrate. So on his way home, he stopped at the liquor store and bought a bottle of wine. And on his way out of the liquor store, he runs into a homeless person, and they bump in, and the homeless dude says, hey, what's in the bag? And my friend says, well, I'm celebrating. I just got a bottle of wine for my wife. And the homeless guy looks at him and says, good trade. Not a hack on women, but what my friend said was not what the homeless person heard. So some of the things I'm going to say, you'll go, well, that makes a lot of sense. Other things, and that's good. Other things I'm going to say, it's like, You'll say, I may have to think about that. It's like, that's even better, because now you're engaging. You're thinking. Because make no mistake, knowledge is power. And power rules the world. And I'm going to say things that you may disagree with. And that's even better. And if there's something that you disagree with, you say, oh, the bald guy from South Dakota is a ding-dong. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Grab me afterwards, and I'd love to have a conversation. Because these are things that have worked for the last 38 years in all aspects of farming. So with management of nitrogen, we need to realize there's two forms of nitrogen out there. Nitrate nitrogen, which is NO3, one nitrogen, 3 oxygen. That is the vegetative or anionic growth stimulator for the plant. What I mean by vegetative or anionic is nitrate nitrogen, NO3, is the nitrogen that grows roots, stem, and leaf. And there it's basically responsible for the first vegetative growth of the relay of growing a plant. Once a plant goes into reproduction, flowering, silking, tasseling, blossoming, whatever it may be, it now has a different appetite. It now wants ammoniated nitrogen or ammoniacal. And the chemical formula for that is NH4. 1 nitrogen, 4 hydrogen. Why is this important? Nobody talks about hydrogen. If your soil pH is over 7, you have a big problem. A lot of the chemical companies and fertilizer companies say, don't worry about that pH. Really isn't that important. pH is incredibly important. It's probably one of the most important things you need to look at, because if your pH is 7, 7.1 or higher, you have no hydrogen on the clay particle. Nobody talks about hydrogen, and pH stands for potential hydrogen. This is a little bit tough to get around, but potential hydrogen, pH, the higher your pH goes, the better your potential, but the lower the actual. And many times when I talk about this, guys will look at me like, what are you talking about? This will probably ring true. If pH stood for potential hair, okay, I figured that would work. If you have a low pH under 6, you have all kinds of hydrogen, but you have other problems. In managing the nitrogen, there's many different forms of nitrogen that you can buy. You got 28% and 32, you got urea, you got ammonium nitrate, you got slow release, sustained release, you got amino acid nitrogen. We're not talking about buying it or applying it, but you need to understand how to manage it. Everybody talks about nitrogen. It's one of the largest inputs that most growers pay for, but it makes up a very, very small portion of what you sell. What do I mean by that? The industry has spent an awful lot of time and money getting us as growers to listen to what spends money that helps other companies that fund research, but not necessarily what helps us as farmers. And yes, I'm a farmer. I'm 3rd generation on our family farm that has now been turned into an organic research farm. Being an organic research farm, we've gotten paid to do an awful lot of testing that didn't work worth a crap. And a lot of people will say, well, that just sounds like farming to us. So the things that I talk about aren't just something that I've heard or read or thought about. It's things that we've used. It's things that we have applied across the country in the 38 states of the U.S. that we deal, all the provinces in Canada and 17 foreign countries. This knowledge works. So when we look at the soil, a lot of speakers will say, well, you have to have healthy soil, balance your soil, but they don't say what that means. They say, you got to have a healthy plant, but they don't identify what healthy means. So in order to get your soil to work, you have to have a balance of minerals, and nitrogen is one of those. In order to get your soil to work, you have to have microbes. And many of the things that we purchase and apply to the soil do not help the microbial activity of the soil. please make no mistake, if the microbes in your soil aren't happy, healthy, and partying, farming gets very, very expensive. When we look at the soil test, you guys have wonderful labs here in Nebraska. Ward Testing, Midwest Labs, and I think any lab and every lab does a good job to try to give you the numbers that you need to make good, honest decisions. If you're not getting both nitrogens on your soil test, nitrate and ammoniated, ammoniacal, you're only looking at the soil test with one eye. What's that mean? In managing your nitrogen, most of the diseases show up at or after reproduction. Think about the fungal diseases, and then you hear the chemical companies talking about, well, we got to health up that plant. We got to protect it. We got to spray that fungicide to keep it healthy. Really? Taking an aspirin if you have a headache makes you healthier? Takes away the pain for a little while, but does it really solve anything? So when we're looking at soil, when we're looking at health, healthy soil, healthy plants, my definition is without disease or without impairment. So when you look at your soil test and you have pretty good nitrate nitrogen, but you don't have much ammoniacal, the NH3. Look at your pH. If you haven't looked at a base saturation on your soil test, that is incredibly important, because the base saturation was created by Dr. Albrecht. And Dr. Albrecht came up with this base saturation, and these numbers are the foundation. They're the launch pad. They're the floor that everything needs to be built off of. And these numbers are very relative to management of nitrogen. In my mind, calcium is the mother of all minerals. If the calcium isn't at the number it needs to be, 68, 69, or 70% base saturation or more, mom isn't in the house. Any good household operates best when mom is taking care of things. Mom, the finder of all lost things, the fixer of all boo-boos, the nester, the creator, the environment builder. And in many cases, in a no-till situation like in a grass or an alfalfa or possibly a rotational corn bean no-till, calcium is kind of a big old gal. She's fairly heavy, and she will slowly settle down into the soil if you don't have microbes to manage and to hold that within the profile. If the calcium isn't in the profile, the microbes aren't in the profile, and the microbes have to be there, and I'm guessing some of us have heard about nitrogen fixers. The nitrogen fixers have to have an environment within that soil to fix nitrogen. Calcium has to be 68% or higher for you to start creating an environment that will manage your nitrogen. The next number that you'll see on your base saturation is normally magnesium. A lot of people don't talk about magnesium, but magnesium is one of 3 electrolyte minerals. And when I say electrolyte mineral, if you ever have had a diuretic child or a scouring calf or a scouring lamb or a foal, you talk to the vet and they said, oh, got bad scours. That animal has something in its digestive tract that's trying to squirt out. And it squirts and squirts and squirts and dehydrates itself. They say, well, give it an electrolyte pack. This is important because potassium, magnesium, and sulfur are your 3 electrolyte minerals. Potassium electrically hangs on to water. So if I was potassium, I'd say, all right, who's got water? Grab it, grab it, grab it, grab it, grab it, grab it. If there's too much potassium in your soil, the plant will feed luxuriously on it, and you'll have a waterlogged, watery, washy plant that is susceptible to every and any kind of disease that comes down the pike. Magnesium is the electrolyte mineral that we want to talk about today. Magnesium electrically hangs on to nitrogen. It stabilizes nitrogen. And if you have an excess of magnesium in your soil, i.e. over 14 or 15% base saturation of magnesium, you're going to see that you have a pile of nitrogen in the soil. And you've probably heard it from a field rep, an agronomist, or a fertilizer salesman. You're looking at your soil test and they're recommending nitrogen. And your obvious question is, I've got a lot of nitrogen right here. Why do I need to buy more? And here come the terms. Well, it's not available, or it's tied up. Well, let's make it available. Let's untie it. If you have an excess of magnesium over 15%, you need to make a call to mom. Calcium. Because calcium will grab onto magnesium and form a bond that Mother Nature creates called dolomite. Calcium and magnesium. When that calcium grabs the magnesium and it electrically bops it on the head, says, let go of that nitrogen. All of a sudden, whoosh, you will see a flush. If you're doing tissue tests, petiole tests, sap tests, you will see it leave the soil and go to the plant. You're like, yeah, this is more like it. If you're farming sand and your magnesium is in the single digits, 7, 8, 9%, nitrogen leaches up, nitrogen leaches down. You need to be in double digits with magnesium to hang on to that nitrogen. Magnesium is also important, and we see magnesium deficiencies in the plant, whether you have a high magnesium, over 15, 18, 20, 30, we've seen up to 45% magnesium, and we've seen as low as 4 or 5% in the beach sand of Florida. The base saturation, the foundation that Dr. Albrecht talked about 50 years ago, is very important to reduce your inputs, to make efficient what you've already purchased, and to start creating life in your soil. So when you look at your soil test, number one is if your pH is over 7, you're not going to make, and the microbes aren't going to be able to make ammoniacal or ammoniated nitrogen, which is the reproduction nitrogen, which is the seed filling, the pod filling, the filling of the kernel, the finishing of the crop. And if you're seeing fungal diseases, Phytophthora, Rhizoctonia, Pythium, tar spot, rust, they're all part of the same scumbag family that affect unhealthy plants. When you have a healthy plant, you will not have to buy a fungicide. When you have a healthy plant, you will not have to buy herbicide. When you have a healthy plant, you will not have to buy insecticide. And I get a lot of guys that say, okay, you just crossed the line, pal. You are so far in the ditch. It's crazy. Many Sundays I don't pay near enough attention to the minister, but I've never heard any minister of any denomination talk about a chemical company or a fertilizer manufacturer by the Garden of Eden. The heirloom varieties that we've started with years ago, to me, were created by God and Mother Nature. And when you understand the balance of how it began, it doesn't have to be this expensive. We've all been exposed to reacting to symptoms. These symptoms are because the soil isn't healthy or the soil isn't working. And it's very hard to have a healthy plant in unhealthy soil. Genetic modifications keep getting added as a reaction to the symptom of an unhealthy plant. What do I mean by unhealthy plant? Magnesium, that we talked about, stabilizes nitrogen on a 1-to-1 basis. And if you can be in that 10% base saturation to 12 or 13 base saturation, it will electrically stabilize nitrogen and hold it for the use of the plant when it needs it. On that same note, when you have microbes in the soil, these microbes will take nitrogen from the air. Now, while we're sitting here, can anybody smell nitrogen? No, because we've been breathing it our whole life. The nitrogen in the air makes up 78% of every breath we take. They haven't figured out how to charge for it yet. They haven't figured out how to tax it yet, but they've worked really, really hard to not let us know how to capture and manage it. So while we're breathing this nitrogen is not in a plant usable form. If you want to manage nitrogen that the cost is very small, it's very inexpensive, and it's natural. You need to make sure that your soil can breathe. Managing the nitrogen means letting some of this air get into the soil. When we're looking at soil, when we're looking at plants, I'm going to jump in and out of several different sciences. Talking about soil physiology, I'm going to jump into meteorology here for just a little bit. The minister of our church used to be a meteorologist, and when my dad was, before he passed, I got to know this minister really well. And he started talking about high pressure fronts and low pressure fronts. And he said a high pressure front is heavy, sinking air. And all of a sudden it's just like, this may be what they're talking about with the respiration of the soil. And so we started checking, this is years and years ago, and we found that when we use the appropriate tip, the small tip for dirt and clay, the big tip for beach sand, and this took us quite a few years to figure out, but we found out that when we were between 100 and 150 psi on this gauge, that high pressure front went into the soil. It's like all of a sudden, this is the respiration they were talking about. This respiration is important because the microbes, most of the microbes that we need in a healthy soil, healthy being without disease or impairment, healthy soil has to have an environment conducive to grow life. These microbes breathe just like we do. They breathe in atmospheric air, which is 78% nitrogen, 19-20% oxygen, 400 and some parts per million of CO2. And a lot of the tree huggers will say, well, 400 parts per million of CO2, it's the highest in civilized history. That must be all kinds of CO2 for the plant. Here's the rest of the story. The plant physiologists that we work with, we started doing carbon monitors on the soil, and this is part of nitrogen management. The reason you guys are spending, or you guys aren't, your neighbors probably are, the reason your neighbors may be spending too much money on nitrogen is because they have a carbon and oxygen deficiency. All the plants that are grown for food want to be made up of carbon and oxygen. When these microbes breathe in, they breathe in this atmospheric air and they give off carbon dioxide, CO2. Some of the companies will say, don't till your soil, you're going to lose all your carbon. CO2 is 1.5 times heavier than atmospheric air. It has to be exhaled up, exhaled up, exhaled up. And we've done CO2 monitors that show the more microbes you have in your soil, the more CO2 that's produced, the lower your nitrogen bill will be. What do I mean by that? Let's say this talk goes okay, and you guys have questions afterwards and say, you know what, I had an awful lot of fun up there. It's like, I'll buy everybody a steak dinner. I had a great time. We go out for this steak dinner, and everybody's thinking, oh, ribeye, porterhouse, filet, this is awesome. Waiters come, and they take our orders. A few minutes later, here comes hot dogs. You're like, I ordered a ribeye. This is a stinking hot dog, and we all know what hot dogs are made of. That is like giving nitrogen to a plant because it wants carbon dioxide. Carbon and oxygen make up 90% of the dry matter weight of a plant. The seed, the stalk, the root, the tassel. If you've never heard this information, it's relatively new information. The earliest I've seen this in print was in the 1850s. Yes, I said the 1850s. This information isn't given out because it's pretty hard for corporate America to make a lot of money off our back. If we can just keep some microbes happy and healthy, exhaling CO2, and as that carbon and oxygen come up in the soil, your management of nitrogen becomes an afterthought. It's not the most important thing. It's a hot dog when you were promised a steak. So if you want to manage your nitrogen, you have to give the microbes in the soil something to eat. Well, we know they breathe air and they give off oxygen with some carbon in there. One of the things that most companies won't talk about is the carbon to nitrogen ratio in your soil. Most college professors and agronomists will say, oh, you got to have soil organic matter. And they're right. It's important. But what I have seen on our farm, being 4.8% soil organic matter, our carbon to nitrogen ratio dropped, and I had weeds that outgrew beans, and I had weeds that outgrew corn. The NRCS has done a wonderful job with putting out a piece of information. It's the NRCS carbon to nitrogen sheet. You can Google it, and it will give you all of the numbers, and those numbers that they are talking about, we spent a horrible amount of money on microbiologists finding out that most soil is 8-to-1, carbon and nitrogen. And if you ask many agronomy professors, it's like carbon to nitrogen, what should it be? And most professors have done this to me. They said, oh, carbon to nitrogen. You probably have 8 times more carbon than nitrogen. Like, oh, God. Second question. So if we have an 8-to-1, what should it be? Then they will kind of hem and haw, and they say, well, if you talk to the microbiologists, an 8-to-1 carbon to nitrogen is just enough carbon to keep microbes alive. They don't reproduce. They don't work for you. They're just there. We know people like this. We probably have some. I have some in my family. They're just there, taking up space, eating food, drinking water, and possibly creating a mess. At 16-to-1 carbon and nitrogen, you are now managing your nitrogen. Because these microbes, if they have 16 times more carbon than nitrogen, they're going to party. And they're going to eat some of this nitrogen, but they're going to give off carbon dioxide, which makes up 90% of the dry matter weight of a plant. That's 90% of every dry matter weight of every bushel or ton of things you guys sell. Nobody tells us this. This is kind of useful information. As you build the carbon and oxygen in your soil, the management of your nitrogen becomes secondary or third or fourth. Now, a lot of guys with the markets being what they are, they say, boy, we got to cut costs. This market sucks. We've got to do something to break even. We have a lot of GMO farmers that have all the traits, use all the chemicals, and they say, God, we get great yields, but there's no money left. Welcome to North American agriculture. As you have tiptoed in one trait at a time, one chemical at a time, you need to slowly back out. Because a lot of guys say, well, I'm going to cut nitrogen. It's like, do not cut your nitrogen until you know what your carbon to nitrogen ratio is. If your soil isn't ready for carbon and microbes, you got to still keep buying nitrogen. So the management of nitrogen, the advancement of nitrogen management that I'm speaking of, is politely put nitrogen where it needs to be, not the front runner. Because what we find is the higher the application of nitrogen, the higher the level of most diseases. What do I mean by that? When the plant is looking for carbon and oxygen, and you give it nitrogen, it's not what it needs to be healthy, to be insect-free, to be disease-free. And I'll give you some numbers that you can take with you. This isn't a rifle scope, it's a refractometer, and it measures the sugar content of the plant. And this has been held away from us for a long time. And if you've never seen one of these or never used one of these, that's no big deal because it's a fairly recent invention. Dr. Brix invented this, I think, in 1863, and has been used by the wine industry very accurately. And if you or your bride or somebody in the family loves a good wine, the grape growers have to get to 22, 23, 24, sometimes 26 brix, B-R-I-X, in order for that grape to make good wine. There has to be fermentation, and for fermentation there has to be microbial food, and that microbial food is sugar. So when we're talking sugar, every plant, unless you're growing mushrooms, but every plant counts on sunshine. It lays its leaves out to gather sunlight, water, and minerals to make sugar. And if you've ever seen a plant that put a leaf out, that leaf was kind of a light, limey green, first thought is, that's a nitrogen deficiency. Maybe, maybe not. Going back into chemistry, magnesium, the potential problem child for tying up nitrogen, magnesium has to be invited to the party that's in the leaf, when the plant is making sugar, because magnesium is involved in photosynthesis and chlorophyll production. A good grower should be able to identify 14 different shades of green. That new leaf, no matter what plant you're growing, the darker it is when it appears and emerges, the quicker it will start gathering sunlight, photosynthesizing, making sugar. Now that is a control and a management because the plant wants sugar. It's a sugar factory, and the more sugar that plant can make, the less nitrogen you guys have to buy. And when you get a plant to 10 bricks or 10% sugar, and what I mean by that is you can take the stalk, the leaf, whatever part of the plant you want, and we've got some awful high-tech equipment up here. If this looks like just a common garlic press, you're absolutely right. Stick some leaf, stick some stem in there, squeeze 2 drops of juice on the prism of glass, and the light will refract. This is maybe why they call it a refractometer. The light will refract and show you what the sugar content of that plant is, the blood of the plant. John Kempf has done a lot of work on sap analysis. Same kind of a thing, but they very seldom tell you the carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen levels in a sap or petiole test. Carbon and oxygen make up 90% of the dry matter weight of a plant. When you have enough magnesium in the soil, because you have air in the soil, and what I mean by air in the soil, when you look at a soil test, my old professor that had the patience of Job would take so much time, and I would be looking at the soil test. He says, you realize that soil test is precisely ambiguous. It's like, I'm not a smart guy, but what are you saying? He says, in an exact set of numbers that really don't tell us what we want to know. What do I mean by that? When you look at a soil test, you look at all these different minerals that are in your soil. Doesn't tell if they're available. Doesn't tell if they're tied up. They're just there. There's one thing that almost every mineral has to be hooked to get from the soil to the plant. It's a simple, common, many times overlooked and very seldom talked about. If you take a big deep breath and think about it, it's oxygen. If you've ever done a tissue test or a petiole test, you will see phosphorus. There was maybe a P1, a P2, or a total P in your soil shows up as a P2O5 or a P2O4. Oxygen. Magnesium, to get to the plant, has to be hooked to oxygen. If the soil can't breathe, the minerals that you have in the soil can't get to the plant. If the plant can't make sugar, you get to buy more nitrogen. If the plant can't make sugar above 10 bricks or more, you're going to have fungal diseases. If you're below 10 bricks of sugar, you're going to have a weed problem. What do I mean by that? A lot of university professors and experts will say, a weed is just a plant growing out of place. But, okay. From what we see, a weed is a mechanic. It's there for a specific reason to fix a specific problem, and many times it's to bring calcium back up because the microbes in the soil are missing calcium, and they have to have calcium for their physical structure. That calcium has to be within the profile. And if you've been in a no-till situation, you may have lost some of the calcium. If no-till is working for you, awesome. But please pay attention that no matter how you farm, there's always risks. No-till, minimum till, full till, organic, chemical, GMO, doesn't matter. We're all trying to make a living. We're all trying to hopefully have the soil in better shape for the next generation. If there isn't air in the soil, magnesium cannot hook to nitrogen. Magnesium cannot hook to the oxygen and get to the plant for the plant to make chlorophyll. The darker the color of the leaf, the more sunshine it will absorb, the more sugar it will make, the less nitrogen you will have to worry about. Full circle. You don't have to be a scientist to understand chemistry. A lot of chemists will say, well, you're a caveman chemist. Some of the stuff you talk about isn't 100% according to textbook. It's like, I'm not a scientist. But I don't have to be a chef to make a sandwich. You don't have to be a chemist to understand chemistry. So when we look at chemistry, a lot of these big companies don't appreciate that. I was sitting at a seed meeting many years ago, and there was this doctor something with a PhD, doesn't matter his name or the company, but he was talking about their genetics. And being the disruptor, I raised my hand and it's like, why does corn dent? He looks at me and goes, where are you from? I said, I'm from South Dakota. Common sense questions. Oh, he says, let me get this right. He re-asks the question twice because he's buying time because he doesn't really have an answer that he wants to give. He says, you're asking, why does corn dent? I said, let me preface that. And I said, I've grown Indian corn for the Corn Palace in South Dakota. When I was in college, that helped pay some of my tuition. Indian corn doesn't dent. I said, popcorn doesn't dent. So again, it's common sense. The bigger the dent, the bigger the shrink, the lighter the test weight, the more diseases, the lower the yield. You get the idea. So I asked him again, why does corn dent? He says it's a natural maturing process of the plant. Okay. And this is as good as it gets? What we found is the higher the nitrogen applications, the lower the sugar content or the lower the test weight. Carbon and oxygen and hydrogen make up 94% of the dry matter weight of that plant. If you don't have carbon and oxygen in your soil, you're going to have to buy a lot of nitrogen. You're going to have to react to symptoms of an unhealthy plant. There's a book written by an agronomist, Jay McCaman, that for many, many years he and I would argue and disagree on things, but he wrote a wonderful book. I don't think he's any longer with us, but he wrote down all of these different weeds and the environment they enjoy. You don't have to buy this book if you don't want to. You could get your neighbor to buy it and tell him that it'll really be wonderful for him. But all of these highlighted weeds are weeds that have naturally gone away once the soil can breathe, once the plants that we planted can photosynthesize. This is the fuel. This is what the plant needs. This is the immunity. And if you're growing crops to feed your animals, this is what gives animals BTUs in cold weather. This is what gives animals the health and the immunity to fight off disease. When you're above 8 to 10 bricks of sugar, you don't have to worry about a fungal invasion of a pathogenic disease causing detrimental fungus, algae, or mold. When you're above 10 bricks of sugar, some of these super weeds or chemical resistant weeds get a little humble. They will start bowing down to you. When you get above 14 bricks of sugar, something really cool happens. The plant-feeding insects that try to destroy things, they're just an indicator. They're an alarm saying this plant isn't high enough sugar. Sitting in church, the minister says, "Why did God create insects?" Well, I actually knew what he was talking about. My hand goes up. Minister says, "Well, Glenn really wasn't looking for an answer, but since you're so excited, go ahead." So God created insects to tell us which plants weren't healthy enough for us to eat. Plant-feeding insects above or below the ground, armyworm, wireworm, rootworm, cutworm, they're there to tell you the plant doesn't have enough sugar. Aphids, leafhoppers, pick your critter, doesn't matter. They are all born and live without a pancreas. They can't digest 14 bricks of sugar. It will ferment, turn to alcohol, and kill them. Wow. What a concept. If you continue to use synthetic nitrogen as much as probably what your neighbors are using, it will be a perpetual problem that goes on and on and on. You will continue to react to symptoms. You will fail to correct the cause, and profitability will be tough. Tougher, especially in low market conditions. I can't see that.
10 minutes.
Okay. They're putting me in the corner here. I gotta focus up. As we're looking at nitrogen, nitrogen is very important. But you have to have magnesium that's available. You have to have calcium that's available. In other words, every mineral, this is what my old professor, how he taught my thick skull to remember some of this stuff. He says, whenever you're looking at something that's unfamiliar, relate it to something that you are familiar with. He said, look at these minerals in the soil like the alphabet. Every letter can be a mineral. In my mind, calcium is mom. And none of us are too old to remember that if mom and dad left the house, left the kids alone, somebody bled. Yep, something got broke. And then you scrambled like heck to put it back together and stop the bleeding before they got back. If calcium and phosphorus, mom and dad, phosphorus is a mineral along with calcium that promotes photosynthetic sugar production. If calcium and phosphorus aren't in the top portion of your soil, nothing is going to work the way you want it to in a healthy environment, growing a healthy plant, which is without disease or without impairment. If your soil is between 100 to 150 psi, and a lot of guys will say, yeah, we just got one of those soil compaction meters, whatever you call it, it's penetrometer. He says, should we test this soil when it's wet or when it's dry? I'll say, yes. They're like, you're not that funny. Water, H2O, there's that hydrogen again. When water hits the soil, it gets mellow. And you can take this and you can go down to your knuckles. Good soil, healthy soil, soil that works, should not get hard when it gets dry. Different angle. Does your personality change when you're in the shower versus out of the shower? You're still you. The soil shouldn't change from wet to dry. If it does, magnesium is a problem child. Calcium, being a big old gal, has probably moved down out of the profile and is allowing things to happen that shouldn't be. Each one of these minerals can be a letter in the alphabet or whatever you choose it to be. But knowing a letter, whether it's a consonant or a vowel, you can now make a word. And when you're able to make words, you now make a sentence, and that sentence turns into a paragraph, and that paragraph can turn into a chapter, and the chapter can turn into a book. What's my point? If I'm bold enough, you allow me to say, research this on your own. This information we've worked over 40 years to try to gather because it isn't readily available. Ask the questions on what should we do to stop reacting to symptoms. So as we look at the 100 to 150 psi, that's where almost all crops love. This is kind of the respiration, the lungs, the pulmonary of the system, the soil, the plant. This is kind of like the blood. This is like doing a blood panel. Know your numbers. The cool thing is, once you get your neighbor to buy these and you tell them that you'll show them how to use them, you've got your own do-it-yourself, and you can use these forever. And the less you count on somebody else for your information, and the more you know, the more you get to write your own book to success. There's one more thing before my time is up, and we will have questions, time for questions. This is like the heart monitor of the soil. This is just a little handheld EC meter. EC stands for electrical conductivity. Why is this important? Ever seen your neighbors get a little tip burn from over applying nitrogen? Yeah. Why? Nitrogen is very electrical. There's a lot of salt in most nitrogens. It's an inorganic salt, and if you get a buildup of salt or sodium, the microbes shut down. If you put down a hot, high EC nitrogen, whether it be banded, Y-drop, whatever it is, if the EC, the electricity, is too high, I think these microbes in the soil are union. They say, oh, I am not going to work in this environment. That EC on this soil probe is a 1.0 or higher. If you see a part of your crop that beans don't grow, or your field that the beans don't grow, or the corn gets a few inches tall and dies and burns up, check the EC. When you use this meter, there's two different readers that send signals back and forth. Stick it in very slow and slowly push down. The more consistent this number is, the healthier your soil is. And what I mean by that, I'll give you actual numbers. Almost every plant that we deal with on this planet enjoys starting its growth from a seed up to reproduction. This should be a 0.3 to a 0.5. That's the electricity that the anionic or vegetative microbes need to help the plant grow root, stem, and leaf. The more this electricity is correct and stable in your soil, the less nitrogen you will have to apply, and the more nitrogen those microbes will get from the atmosphere. When a plant goes into reproduction, this number needs to be higher. For anybody that's getting a little long in the tooth like I am, reproduction takes energy. And the energy of the plant, that soil around the root zone, the rhizosphere, should be a 0.6 to a 0.9. 0.6 to 0.9. This is the heartbeat, that when the heartbeat is working, and the more consistent that number is of your EC as you're pushing down through the soil, the more biologically influenced that number is. The more consistent that number is, the less nitrogen you have to buy in the future, because the microbes are working, they're happy, and they're healthy. So in managing your nitrogen, see what your plant is photosynthesizing. See if it's making sugar. See if it's doing what it's supposed to. See what the pressure of your soil is. If you're over 200 psi, the microbes say, hey, we are not working under this stressful condition. We're checking out. A feeder root can't push through 300 psi. See if there's breath. I'm guessing that's my cue. See if there's fuel, and see if there's a heartbeat. So with that, I hope this information has been valuable.